borders the San Gabriel River, where the coyotes live. Andrew Hewen with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife wants them to stay there. He says some coyotes have been killed since these attacks.
We eliminated 5 coyotes from the park, and we're hoping that those were the offending animals, but we won't know that for several more days. People are going to have to be much more diligent about their food and their behavior in the park, hopefully to reduce the aggressive behavior of the coyotes.
He says, don't run if you see one. Call 911 or animal control if you feel threatened. It's 11:29.
KPCC supporters include the Orange County Museum of Art in Newport Beach. The museum's new exhibition, American Mosaic, features 65 works from the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C., created between the 1880s and the 1960s. The exhibition highlights American masters, from Winslow Homer to Helen Frankenthaler, whose work embodied a culture of independence, diversity, and experimentation, and changed the course of art in this country. Details at ocma.net.
So many Northerners are moving to Cary, North Carolina, the city has gotten a nickname, Containment Area for Relocated Yankees. And that's changing the state's politics.
I've heard somebody joke that, Republicans from New England come down there and realize that they're actually a Democrat in North Carolina.
And it's not just North Carolina. The politics of the New South later on All Things Considered from NPR News.
Weekday afternoons at 4 on 89.3 KPCC.
Pleasure to have you with us on Air Talk. I'm Larry Mantle. We hear a lot about presidential polls every 4 years during August, either during or after the party's political conventions. And part of that is news organizations are desperate for material. We don't have a lot of other news that's going on, so polls get glommed onto by cable news and newspapers and the like. But the question is, at what points are presidential polls the most volatile and inaccurate? And in what period do they start settling down with truly more predictive ability? And that, of course, comes after the high inaccuracy rate that we saw 4 years ago when the presidential polling was done. With us to talk about it is Kathy Frankovic, who's former CBS polling director and analyst at YouGov, an international internet-based market research firm. Kathy, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me, Larry.
I appreciate it. So is this one of the worst times, a couple weeks away from the conventions to know what voters really think?
Well, I've always said that August is a terrible month for polls. It's a bad time to conduct them. It's still summertime. People are in their summer mode, and they may not have focused a lot of attention on politics. On the other hand, this year, the party conventions were much earlier than usual. They usually sort of push Labor Day. At least they did 4 years ago and 8 years ago. And so this year, they're done. And so we might expect to see a little bit of settling down. Another thing that makes this year slightly different, I think, is that 80% of registered voters say they have a pretty good idea of who they're going to vote for, which leaves about 20% kind of still on the fence, maybe a little bit. Now, having said that, I'm going to say some things that tell us why there are differences between the polls.
Yeah.
I think that all the legitimate polls are saying the same thing in principle, which is that Hillary Clinton is ahead of Donald Trump, that she may have made some gains after her convention, that Donald Trump may have hurt himself in the last couple of weeks with some of his statements. On the other hand, we have a case where we have a slightly more volatile situation because of the fact that we have a third party and a fourth party candidate. And most polls are asking people to choose among 4 candidates: Clinton, the Democrat; Trump, the Republican; Johnson, the Libertarian; and Stein, the Green Party candidate. Now, what happens when you do that is that some people who may be dissatisfied with Clinton and Trump, and there are a lot of people in that category, are choosing a third and fourth party candidate. And so having done that, we may not be seeing a perfect reflection of where public opinion is on the 2 major party candidates.
And I would
traditionally,
Go ahead.
traditionally, third and fourth party candidates fade as the election draws closer. We don't know if that's going to happen this year, but that's the historical pattern.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I think it's particularly complicated because it's not like a third party, Ralph Nader, who's comparatively well known to the public. You've got, even though Gary Johnson and Jill Stein were both their party's nominees last time around, they never broke through last time. So they're even though they're getting more attention because of the difficulty of the two major party candidates to make people happy, they're still not known quantities.
That's right. And it's not clear in the case of Johnson which part of the electorate he's drawing support from. I mean, he's certainly appealing to some people who supported Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primary, and he's obviously appealing to the people who opposed Donald Trump in the Republican primary and caucus process. So there's a little, I would say, ideological ambiguity about him. And right now, in most polls, he does much better than Jill Stein.
One of the things I'm really curious about is how the accuracy of polls can improve when comparatively few people have landlines anymore. That skews older. There's, I'm sure, an economic divide that's there too, and people are now getting more and more robocalls on their cell phones. So maybe they're not picking up as much as they used to on a cell phone. They're texting more. How do polls take account of all this?
Well, I think we have to talk about two directions where phone usage is going. On the one hand, people are cutting landlines. We know that's been happening for the last 20 or 25 years. Right now, probably half the population can't be reached on a landline, and most don't even answer their landlines when they're called. So pollsters must use cell phones, must do a sample of mobile phones. That creates problems for pollsters because while we do know something about the distribution of those telephones, we don't know physically where people are. We have to interview people in situations where they may not want to be interviewed. They could be in a public place. They're not necessarily at home. And the response rate is also low. And functionally, telephone surveys response rates are extremely low. They've been dropping for years, and they're now sort of in the single digits, which raises all sorts of questions about, this is not new. This is something that we were edging towards 4 years ago. And I'm going to take issue with something you said earlier. Yeah. The polls immediately prior to the 2012 presidential election in the United States were actually quite accurate. So, it's all the preliminary discussion and all the preliminary polling that I think affects people's perception. This year, we're affected by what happened in Great Britain over Brexit. And so we want to take that information and apply it to polls done here. It may affect us. It may not. It probably doesn't. So we have this problem with telephone surveys. Where do we go? A lot of people are migrating to surveys that are conducted online, using online panels. For many people, this violates the principal rule of survey research. You want to give everyone an opportunity to be selected. That's why telephones were such a great invention and so helpful to polling accuracy when most people had landlines. And that's not the case with internet polling, because not everybody's online, not everybody opts into an internet panel. So there's a lot of waiting that takes place. There's a lot of taking data that's gathered online and taking data now that's gathered by telephone and adjusting it to match known population distributions or known distributions politically. So there's a lot of work that's taking place. People are learning things. And I think, given this kind of disparity, it's kind of interesting that at least at this point in time, everybody thinks, every poll says that Clinton is ahead. The margin varies.
We're talking with Kathy Frankovic, former CBS polling director, analyst now at YouGov. If you have questions for her about how polls are conducted and what the accuracy rates typically are, we're at 866-893-KPCC. I think one of the things that, for many of us shocking is how small the sample size can be with a comparatively small margin of error. So how can you do, say, a poll of 1,500 people or whatever and get a margin of error of 4%?
This question has been asked since the days George Gallup started polling in the 1930s. The principle is that you are selecting a population that is, it adequately represents the larger population. Actually, the sample size doesn't move very much. The ideal sample size doesn't move very much, even as the population grows. So this notion of 1,500 people or even 1,000 people representing the entire country has been with us since the 1930s. So it's kind of like the example people like to use is I'm cooking a soup and I want to make sure it's hot enough, so I taste a little bit of it. I don't have to eat it all. Or we have to measure your blood. We'll take a small sample of it, and I don't have to take all of your blood to tell you what your cholesterol level is. So that's the principle that probability sampling is based on. It's obviously getting harder and harder to do that easily. It's getting more and more difficult to do. But, public opinion pollsters and survey researchers in general, market researchers in general, have been working on how to make this better now for a long time. You obviously do some adjustments after the fact to make sure that you haven't missed a certain subgroup of the population.
Real quickly,
and
Ramos.
If I could just add one.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to add something about mobile phones. One of the reasons that mobile phones is very helpful is that minority populations are actually more easily reachable on mobile phones than they are reachable on landlines. And that's been true for more than a decade. African Americans, Hispanics, etc.
All right. Thank you so much for being with us. Appreciate your joining us to talk about the state of presidential polling these days. Thank you, Kathy Frankovic.
Thank you.
Former CBS polling director and analyst at YouGov. You can share your comments about presidential polls today on the Air Talk page, kpcc.org. Coming up, we're going to be taking a look at a couple of bills that would seek to toughen sentencing for those convicted of sexually assaulting an unconscious person. We'll talk about the controversy over those bills right after a live update from Hetty Lynn Hurdes.
Larry, it's day 4 of cancellations and delays at Delta nationwide due to computer problems. More than 2,100 flights have been canceled so far this week, and there are still some headaches for travelers, with hundreds of delays reported today, along with at least 30 cancellations. Delta CEO Ed Bastian said they knew they had to make technology upgrades, but they didn't believe they had this type of vulnerability regarding its flight ops and reservation systems. If you're heading out on Delta, best still to call the airline. Some 41 people are in temporary shelters today after fire tore through 3 multifamily homes in the Pico Union area yesterday. It took more than 140 firefighters to put out the flames. A section of Pico Boulevard was closed at the height of evening rush hour. No one was injured, but a dog was killed. An investigation is underway into what caused the blaze. A new report says Southern California would benefit more than any other region in the country from reducing ozone and fine particle pollution below federal limits. The finding from scientists at NYU and the American Thoracic Society estimates better air quality standards would prevent over 3,000 deaths a year in the LA metro area and more than 800 in the Inland Empire. Checking traffic in Glendora on the 210 West at Sunflower. There's a stalled vehicle blocking the left lane. Traffic is slow from the 57. It's 11:42 at KPCC.
KPCC supporters include Chalk Children's, offering the only Level 4 neonatal intensive care unit in Orange County, the highest level designated by the American Academy of Pediatrics. Chalk's neonatologists are specially trained to treat the most fragile newborns. They are trained to care for micro-preemies and for those needing complex surgery. Chalk is focused on providing the greatest care with new advancements in medical treatment. Learn more at chalk.org/NICU.
The World brings you stories from the Rio Olympics, and they're not just about the athletes.
People are still very much aware of the political machinations going on in the background. People are still incensed.
But you have the positive side as well, which is how welcoming Cariocas are.
Cariocas, the people of Rio, a big part of the story of this year's Games. Olympic coverage continues on The World.
Weekdays at 2 on 89.3 KPCC.
Good morning, it's Air Talk. I'm Larry Mantle. You probably recall the outcry over a Stanford University student convicted of raping an unconscious Stanford University student, or someone who's associated with the community. The perpetrator only received a 6-month sentence. In the wake of that, a couple of bills have been proposed in Sacramento. One would require a mandatory minimum sentence for anyone convicted of raping an unconscious or intoxicated person, and it would remove probation as a sentencing option. The other bill would require anyone convicted of that crime required to serve a full sentence without time off for good behavior. But this seems to be in conflict with Proposition 57, which Governor Jerry Brown has sponsored. That proposition calls for doing away with many of the mandatory minimum sentences, which were one of the factors in jail overcrowding here in California. With us to talk about these two bills is the president of the California District Attorneys Association, the DA for San Mateo County, Stephen Wagstaff. Sir, thank you for being with us.
Good morning, Larry.
This was perceived by many people to be kind of a loophole, the idea that you would treat rape of an unconscious person differently than forcible rape of someone who is conscious. Do you see this as fixing that loophole?
Well, it certainly does. That obviously there was the outrage over that one case, but there are loads of these cases around the nation, certainly in our state, and that was the goal, to simply say, hey, for this type of a crime, there shouldn't be that difference.
Okay, and what about the concern, though, that, this becomes incremental once you say, okay, well, this crime is so terrible, we need to have mandatory minimum sentencing, then, other legislators have other crimes they think are deserving, and pretty soon you're back to everything having mandatory minimums.
Yeah, and nobody wants to go there, even prosecutors. We don't want to go there because we do believe that discretion is appropriate for a judge. We're talking about, though, the rape of a person, and that one is in what we view as in the higher level of crimes that should be dealt with the most harshly. We certainly don't believe we should be going back to minimums like that for the nonviolent lesser offenses.
Are you concerned that because these bills are in response to the public outcry over one case, as disturbing as that was for many people, you concerned about legislating on the heels of something so emotional?
It's always a concern, but it's not new. This has been going on. I've been a prosecutor for 39 years from the day I got into the business. So often the legislature reacts, and the public reacts, to an individual case. And that's why we have our system of the legislature evaluating it, making sure it isn't just on that, and then a governor who acts as a safety net to make sure that we aren't simply overreacting due to one particular case.
Is it possible, if the bill on the mandatory minimum passes, that if you've got cases that just have a lot of gray areas because of perhaps mutual intoxication or just a lot of lack of clarity on the accounts, that jurors might be less likely to convict knowing that there's a mandatory minimum attached?
Well, that should not exist because jurors are not told what the mandatory minimums are. A jury is told, decide the case, decide the facts, and leave the sentencing to the judge. And unless somebody is on that jury who has knowledge, they never know what the punishment is until it's all done.
All right, we're talking with Stephen Wagstaff. He's the head of the California DA Association and District Attorney for San Mateo County. Also with us, William Weinberg, criminal defense attorney based in Irvine. Thank you, sir, for being with us.
My pleasure.
What are your concerns about the two bills?
Well, there's an old phrase, a very old phrase, that hard cases make bad law. And the idea behind that maxim is that in high-profile cases like the Stanford case, it lit up so many people with anger that they launched several bills in the Assembly to tighten up the law or increase the penalty. And that's obviously within the ambit of the legislature's authority to do that, and that's great after careful debate and consideration. One thing I've learned after practicing law for almost a quarter of a century is that each case rises and falls on its own merits, both from the prosecution side as well as the defense side. And there are many, many nuances that can get lost in the shuffle. If you eliminate the ability of a judge to sentence somebody under very specific circumstances to probation, you're taking the power away from the people who are closest to the set of facts, and essentially handcuffing them to prevent them from doing their job as they were sworn to do it.
Mr. Wagstaff was saying he didn't think that this would have an effect on jurors because they wouldn't know about a mandatory minimum sentence. Do you think it might have an effect on jurors, particularly in cases that are complicated cases and difficult to discern which narrative is the correct one?
No, and I think Mr. Wagstaff's right. The jury's not supposed to know what the potential outcomes are if they make a finding of guilt. That's an incorrect obligation, an incorrectly applied obligation. I think what I'm talking about, though, is something slightly different. And that in his scenario, the one you posed earlier, a jury decides if there's reasonable doubt or not, based upon all the information given to them. What I'm talking about is everything else that leads up to trial. After all, less than 10% of all criminal filings go to trial in the United States. So the attorneys on the case know the cases intimately and can fashion a result that satisfies all the parties, potentially. And I would agree with Mr. Wagstaff. I think probably very few cases where the aggravated fact would merit a probation sentence.
I guess, and maybe my case was a one-off. A number of years ago, I served jury duty, and the case that I was hearing, the defense attorney rather cleverly let the jury know that his client was exposed to a third strike offense, and because that's not supposed to. But he had a rather clever way, and I don't know whether that was common or not, but it certainly gave us, the sense that this was third strike, and that didn't have an outcome an effect on what the outcome was in the case. But that's what I was wondering, is if that kind of telegraphing can go on from the defense.
It definitely has been done numerous times by the defense, and the effect of it, of course, is that it telegraphs to the jury to harden up, even maybe perhaps beyond a reasonable doubt, what their standard ought to be in making a determination, and that deviates from what the law is in California. If the legislature decided to tackle that separately and under certain circumstances let juries know that would be a separate pursuit, but I think that was improper, but although it's done frequently.
Jeff in San Gabriel, good to have you with us. What do you think of these two proposed bills?
It appears that they seem to be like knee-jerk reactions because, as it seems, the laws on the books are already pretty stringent if they're applied to their maximum. And the talk of legislation to eliminate any type of probation or any discretion of the judge actually obfuscates and takes away the attention from the actual issue, which is the judge's judgment. In that Stanford case, for example, he had all the facts. The young man was convicted. It's just the sentence was poor. So it's not an issue of whether or not the system worked or whatnot. It was the judge's application, the judge's judgment.
Let's hear Stephen Wagstaff's response to that. Yeah, and so is the proper answer to take part of this out of the judge's hands?
That's a great question that Jeff just pointed out, because there are many people. For instance, the people who are doing the recall movement here in Santa Clara County, next door to my county, of that judge, they are emphasizing, hey, it was a legal sentence that he imposed. It was just unreasonable, and we're going to react by taking that judge out. The Santa Clara County DA is a proponent of this law to make it mandatory prison, and I've talked with him, and Mr. Rosen's theory is, no, this is just something should go beyond the Brock Turner case. This isn't just Brock Turner legislation. It provoked the conversation, but the reality is it does. People who commit this type of crime, like forcible rape, belong in prison.
Ben writes on the Air Talk page, these are not the ways to remedy ridiculous sentences. Judges who show clear bias should be